Welcome to the GreenPilled Network podcast. If you're just joining us, we're building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world. This podcast features the people who are doing it, and we publish an episode of about 10 episodes every couple months. This season is Lean Mean Capital Allocation Machines. Off-chain capital allocation is mirrored by intermediaries. It's not scalable. It's not precise. What are the ways in which we can do better capital allocation on-chain? Can we build scalable, precise capital allocation machines? Can we remove intermediaries? Can we build more transparent, evolutionary capital allocation ecosystems by using the properties that blockchains give us? What are the coolest experiments that are doing this? This is the theme of Greenpill Season 4, Lean Mean Capital Allocation Machines. One special thing we're doing this season is allowing you to collect each episode. All episodes during this season are available on chain. Thank you so much to our collectors this month: JT Nickel, Hal.eth, 0x Lucas, Skydow, James.eth, MMA on chain, and Sean W. Brand.eth. There's a couple other people who've collected episodes, but they don't have ENS name set, so I can't read out their addresses out loud. Anyway, go to pods.media/greenpill and collect an episode, set an ENS name, and I will shout you out during the episodes. If you want to learn more about the Greenpill podcast, you can visit our website at greenpill.network, or you can download the Greenpill book for free, join the Discord, and become a member of your local greenpill.network chapter at greenpill.network. Our guests today on the show are from Grants Ships. They are the founders of Grant Ships. Chris, Jordan, and Matt. They are they each individually have their own history with contributions in the DAO space, from organizations as diverse as Public House, DAO House, Metacartel, Public Nouns, and they are thinkers about capital allocation in the DAO space. So basically, what they have built is an app called Grants Ships, and you can check it out at grantships.fun. Grant Ships is a framework for pluralistic grant giving. So basically, it's a competitive capital allocation system where capital allocation programs, so basically grant programs, can compete with each other to allocate capital for a DAO. And there's a voting period at the end where basically token holders get to vote on which program did the best job of allocating capital, and then Grant Ships can run another round where it's reshifted the weights of who's giving out capital according to who won the previous round. So I kind of think of it as like a container for exploring the design space of capital allocation. You can have capital allocation programs A, B, and C, and D competing with each other in order to allocate capital for a DAO ecosystem, and the best project will win if they set up this evolutionary container in the right way. So it's kind of breaking my brain to think about this a little bit. We've explored a couple of different capital allocation mechanisms so far this season. All said and done, we'll probably explore dozens. But I like this idea of setting up an evolutionary game where capital allocation mechanisms and programs can compete with each other, and there's sort of like a Darwinistic fitness function to the best ones getting to continue. And what is this going to look like when we run hundreds of Grant Ships programs and we evolve the best capital allocation mechanisms for the community? So I think that Chris, Jordan, and Matt are super smart, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode of Greenpill on Grant Ships. All right. Chris, Jordan, Matt, how's it going? Welcome to the show.
Going good. Good. Well. Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Maybe we'll start off with a quick round of intros. We'll start with Chris and then go to Jordan and then go to Matt.
Yeah, I'm Chris, otherwise known as Boiler or Boiler Rat on out in Web3 world. Currently a member at DAO Masons, and have also been a contributor at Metacartel and Public House, DAO House, and Public Nouns.
Hey, I'm George, core contributor at DAO Masons, also was a core contributor at a DAO House, a DAO nerd developer. That's pretty much it.
Hey, I'm Matt Davis, aka UI369 out there in the Web3 world. One of the co-founders with these two guys, DAO Masons, past core contributor at DAO House. I have a past life as a full-time software developer, kind of got into organizational design, holacracy, and things like that, and kind of helping build DAOs these days.
Great. Well, it feels like y'all have done your reps around the DAO space, and I'm curious to hear what you're working on now. So tell me about Grant Ships.
Yeah, so grant ships is a way for a DAO to basically say, I would like to put a certain amount of funding into grants in general, and then that goes into grant ships, and then what will happen is that liquidity is fractalized into many or X amount of sub entities, programs, basically grant programs. We call them grant ships. And then there is a period of time where those grant ships compete to best allocate funding in the ecosystem. And then there may be a gestation period where essentially the projects have time to build. And after that period of time, everything is done through Allo and is recorded on chain. So our app will present to the voters what each ship has funded and the progress of each project. And then the DAO does a token curated vote or token curated registry of each vote of each ship. And the proportion of funds that each ship gets will be in proportion to the amount of vote that it gets in that period. The idea is essentially that the game that grant ships is will be adapting to the stated and revealed preferences of voters over time.
Anyone else have anything to add? If not, I've got more questions.
Yeah, we kind of take our turns saying what grant ships is. I think George did a pretty good job. Basic idea is that you can have multiple teams doing grant allocation under one umbrella. You put your money in one pile, split it up, watch how they do, have a vote at the end to kind of say how we think they did, and then the funding for each of those groups going forward is determined by that vote. And there's a lot of complexity revealed inside of that. We have some cool stuff for anti-capture using HATS protocols, so the DAO maintains control over who these allocators are. So if you end up with just like a bad actor or somebody AFK for too long, you can revoke the hat, and the funds are safe. We have some checks and balances with game facilitators and things like that. We can get in more of those details, but at its core, it's a governance system enforced by smart contracts that give you a lot of the basic kind of rules and pathways that you would want for a grants program. And we draw a lot from game design. It's kind of like sitting down at a board game. You've got some rules and basic moves you can make. And then hopefully good grants come out.
So invite the listener to check out grantships.fun, which is the main site behind Grant Ships. And then you can actually click on the rules and see the rules of the game. But it feels like high level for me, it seems like what you're doing is creating sort of like an evolutionary container where grants programs can compete against each other for the capital of the DAO. And then over time, as there's different epochs of funding, it's sort of evolutionary where the DAO can choose which grant programs are doing the best job of allocating capital. So going from a world where there's just one team doing a grant distribution to multiple teams that are sort of competing with each other, and you can compare and contrast them with each other. Is that too reductionist? Is that close?
Yeah, and
That's
I'll,
it.
and I'll yeah, and I'll add that like we try not to be prescriptive in how a ship would actually operate their program. Right now, we're using a direct grants model, which is a strategy from Allo that we just customized to work with our game. So we're going to use like a milestone based model at the moment, but we feel that we also want to challenge different distribution models, such as quadratic funding or RGFs or anything like that. We want to be able to fit within a ship so that we can also test which models work best in different situations.
So how's it going? I think y'all have done a couple pilot rounds. Can you talk tangibly about what you've learned? I guess what's the meme is that no plan survives first contact with reality. I'm curious your first pilot program. What have you learned, and what's the next experiment look like informed by those learnings?
Pilot program is still upcoming. So we're about to meet reality. We're in that stage right now. So we've been in our ivory tower for a couple months. We've been developing our app. App's close to ready. I can do a demo at some point if you'd like. But yeah, so we're about to hit reality. We got a beta round coming up, hopefully around early mid-April. And that's when we'll really, get some valuable learnings and kind of see what expected behavior, sort of worked out and what didn't. But yeah, that'll be really valuable, and we're really excited for that.
Yeah, I was going to say with the beta round, one of the challenges has been deciding how to scope the thing. So we received a grant through the Arbitrum Foundation and Plurality Labs. So we kind of have a general mandate to provide impact for Arbitrum, but that's very broad. So if it were just like provide impact for Arbitrum grants program, it could be nearly anything. So we were looking for a little bit more of a contained ecosystem to hold the grants program. And so we have a few different areas that we're looking at, like governance tooling. We're looking at stylus, and gaming. Some others would be really interesting, but we kind of have to get a bit of a community, a pre-existing community that are going to run the ships and kind of have the ideas for what make good grants and things like that. So we're making that choice, and then we've got a bunch of ARB through the grant program that will run through grant ships when we do the beta. And yeah, that'll be where we get to test all this great game theory stuff we like to talk about.
Yeah, excited to see what happens with the pilot, and I guess I'm wondering what a very successful pilot looks like for you. Can you sort of paint me a picture of what you would like to see?
I would love something where the signal that we're expected to learn from is clear and is non-ambiguous as possible, so that we know clearly where it did well and clearly where it did not, so that we can iterate on the next round as quickly as possible, and to sort of get through this idea maze as quickly as possible.
It strikes me that, given that there's sort of like an iterative evolutionary frame to how these grants compete with each other, I'm reminded of the differences in how organisms that have a short lifespan and a short reproduction cycle, how fast they evolve relative to organisms that have a longer lifespan or reproductive cycle. Think about like rabbits versus like elephants or something like that. And I've also, having worked in organizations that have an 18-month sales cycle versus like a 1 week sales cycle, the latter can iterate much faster. And so I'm curious to see with with grants programs how measurable the results are on like tighter epochs, and how that can generate more evolution over time, because evolution is just such a powerful thing, but it has to be subject to like a fitness function, and really curious to see where the rubber meets the road on that.
Yeah, that's a tricky trade-off, right? Because on one hand, you have everyone has been talking to us about impact evaluations, right? Because of season 3, and obviously has to factor into the vote. Like, it would be amazing if once we decide on the domain of our round, we can also decide on how we can measure things. But ultimately, we still want to have the control in the voters' hands, if that makes sense, so that someone can look at the information and then make an informed choice, afterwards, right? And still be able to rebel. And I think what that provides is a way to also provide feedback to the impact evaluation. Does that make sense? Like a way to say like, okay, yeah, I noticed that they got X score, but maybe I disagree with how this was counted, so I'm going to vote this way, or
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of similar problems that we've seen with Optimism Retro PGF3. They just said that basically badge holders had no orientation about how to vote, and I think that they said that in future Retro PGF rounds, like actually putting the data out there so that badge holders can make a more data informed decision. It kind of feels similar to that in a way. I know, push back if I'm wrong, but
no,
that was
that's
a thread that I connected.
Yeah,
yeah, that's exactly
it's
it.
definitely something. It's definitely something that we spent a lot of time kind of looking at what was available out there for tools that we can integrate with grant ships, and we kind of did settle on some. We may end up using some of them, but in the end, we work best as that data layer. And being that all our data is going to be available on chain or IPFS, the fact that it's available to any sort of impact evaluation method is probably the best thing that we can do within our app at this moment. I don't know if we'll ever see a perfect thing.
Yeah, I guess
So
ideally
yeah,
in a perfect world, right? Like, you would have your selection, and then I'm kind of visualizing like a bunch of faders, like in a recording studio where you can adjust the level of some sort of impact evaluation based on your preferences, like what's important to you, and then it creates a ranked score for each ship or something like that. I mean, that would be I don't that's out of scope for now for us, but I mean that would be awesome, something like that, right? Where it sort of blends a bunch of different scoring mechanisms.
We often say, well, the grant programs that have the highest impact will be rewarded with extra funds going forward. But the truth is, the grant programs that receive the most votes will be rewarded with more funds, and then we would anticipate that people care about impact enough to vote for the ones that they perceive having the highest impact. But the votes are the fitness function, and then we're just hoping to put information in front of the voters so that they can inform themselves. But it would be nice if something like this could kind of have almost like a press emerge around it to like look at how people are doing and kind of report on, hey, here's what I see, if you care about this is a good one. And just some conversation around what's going on so that the community can home in on what it cares about and if those things are being represented in their grants programs.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to create that evolutionary container around the grants programs, where you tie impact, not a, impact equals profit, not only for the individual grantees, but at the level of the grant program, you're tying continuing funding to impact, and so it feels like almost like a zipper, like you dial it in at the grantee level and at the program level, and that feels like it can be powerful. So I have to have you back and figure and ask you what you learned after the initial pilot
We've
at sometime
evolved
this
the
summer.
ultimate grants program. It's unstoppable.
I was going to say that like eventually like we do kind of see a marketplace almost of ships developing so that people that develop a good program and are really good at allocating in a certain domain, they might not necessarily fit with a round of grants or something like that. So we do kind of imagine a situation where is being funded, what sort of rounds are existing, then people can pick the perfect sub DAO, I guess, that could be used in that situation.
Are you planning on franchising this out to other DAOs? I know that you said you're starting with Arbitrum, but how long until if I'm at DAO X or L2X can I use Grant Ship?
I would say basically after our tests, like we would love to test it out as many places as possible. I think that's better signal, right? And would really help us iterate our product is because every DAO has and this is one of the great gifts of being in a space like at this moment right now is DAOs are really developing their own kind of feel and flavor, even just comparing and contrasting, Arbitrum and Optimism alone, right, is pretty cool. So, to see how it behaves in different environments would be great.
Yeah, I'm wondering, if you think of this as like an evolutionary search space and we're trying to find the local maxima of some utility function where that utility function is defined as, I don't know, let's just call it impact equals profit. It might be different on a per DAO basis, but like if you were to give the exact same program design and put it in Optimism versus Arbitrum versus Polygon versus ZK Sync, would it evolve different programs over time because those DAOs have different value sets or different political economies? If you run the same experiment 1,000 times, does it discover different mechanisms in different ecosystems? That would be like a really interesting experiment for me to see.
Yeah, like what I'm hoping for more or less is vibrancy and adaptation as opposed to like finding some singular truth.
Mm,
That would be ideal, like to see how things, yeah, like you said, like adapt to different environments. I think that would be even
yeah.
cooler.
Usually we think of like 3 grant ships running in a particular program. And so, yes, they're competing, but they're also learning from each other at the same time. Everything they do is pretty visible and transparent. It's on chain. And we have feeds in our app. So you're going to kind of see what the other ships are doing. So we anticipate some best practices kind of, transferring. I don't know if there's a genetic gene transfer, lateral gene transfer or something, so there will be kind of an evolution in that way. So if you had the thing running across different platforms like that, I would like it to see them learning from each other too, best practices kind of memeing their way across the gene pools.
Yeah, it's interesting. They're not only competing with each other, but they're also cooperating with each other. It's like a co-opetition, probably similar in some ways to what we see in nature with multiple organisms that have symbiotic relationships, but
Yeah,
also zero-sum relationships with each other in a way.
Yeah,
right.
ideally
And
that's what it becomes.
so when you vote, you don't. It's not uh, like this one and none of the others. You could kind of be like 80% on this one, 20% on the other. So it could be like an emergent budgeting system. Like a grant ship might find its niche. Like, what, we get 15% of the vote every time by doing this thing that they like, and we're not the behemoth on the plains, but we have our niche. And it might look like you're not out competing everybody because you're not getting the bulk of the vote, but you found a survival strategy. Again, that's all game theory that we're thinking about. We'll know when we see it for real, but different patterns like that could emerge.
It also makes me wonder sort of how to compare different mechanisms or approaches to each other. Like, so for example, Gitcoin now offers three mature capital allocation mechanisms: direct grants, which are great because they're just simple, but they're centralized; quadratic funding, which is great because it's democratic. The person in the outer orbit of that ecosystem gets a say in where the capital is allocated; and then retroactive public goods funding, which indexes on the axis of time. It's easier to see in retrospect what has had impact. And I don't know, are you comparing apples to oranges to pears by comparing a direct grants to a retroactive grants to a democratic funding pilot? Um, I mean, in some ways you are, but in other ways, a dollar has to be allocated somewhere, and it's a zero sum game between all the mechanisms. So yeah, I feel like there's a question or like a thread to pull somewhere in there. But yeah, different capital allocation mechanisms doing different things well is definitely something that we think a lot about at Gitcoin.
We're noticing this a lot as we try to like set up our beta round, is how difficult it is to set up that scope. First, you need like a scoped community who is interested and will participate, because obviously if no one's participating, then the signal quality is low, and it could be like a bad feedback loop. But another thing is like setting up a game is kind of like experiment design, right? You have to think about like, what are we going to learn from this? So if we want to compare the efficacy of different programs, or different styles of strategies and stuff like that you'd kind of have to scope the rules of your game to cater to that. Whereas if like our beta round is all the same strategy, everything's direct grants, we're more comparing the efficacy of the allocators themselves and how they behave within those bounds. So it's definitely like a learning experience for us too, to try to figure out how to set that up.
Right. For our beta, in the end, it would be up to DAOs choosing to implement grant ships to set that up. So you probably see a lot of different answers to that question, and hopefully there's enough rounds that you would see some interesting trials. Quadratic versus direct funding.
Another way I sort of envision the end state here, which by the way, I gotta say, like, my vision is remarkably similar in a lot of ways to, I think in yours, the word pluralism, I think comes to mind for me also. Although I never conceived of putting the grants programs in an evolutionary container. But one of the ways that I conceive the end state here is that, similar to how we have client diversity at the consensus layer and the execution layer of the Ethereum network, where no client has dominance, and therefore a failure of one client won't lead to a failure of the entire network. I envision that each DAO that's above, I don't know, let's call it $100 million in size, will have a plurality of capital allocation mechanisms, and none of them will get above, like, I don't know, 25% of the capital. And what that does is, like, if your DAO has grant ship and retroactive funding and quadratic funding and, I don't know, conviction voting and direct to contract incentives, basically it becomes hard to game all of the DAO's capital allocation mechanisms. And it's through the plurality of capital allocation mechanisms that you create a rich, vibrant, diverse ecosystem of capital allocation in that community. And so, yeah, I don't know, it feels like the end state of our visions is somewhat similar, but you're applying this evolutionary pressure, whereas we're providing this Swiss Army knife that has a bunch of different capital allocation mechanisms in it So yeah, I don't know. Feel free to react to that, but I think that the end state is very similar in our visions.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the origin story of grant ships came from a contest or a joke race that Disruption Joe put up about a year ago now. And he just like design a pluralistic framework for or a grants program, and we're like, that sounds great. He had a couple really cool articles that or even I think they were just forum posts that really resonated with us. And I think even before that, it wasn't really on our mind, like the pluralistic grants frameworks. We're just like, that's a great idea. Let's really dig in deep and see what we can do with it.
Yeah. And you mentioned the Swiss Army knife that you guys are working on. There's a reason we chose to, like pop out one blade from the Swiss Army knife for our test. But having lots of different tools within grant ships will be kind of give it some longevity and a little bit more flexibility. But we often call it a meta framework, where we're not prescriptive about the grants part. We're kind of one level above that, where it's like we're holding a container, we've designed a game within which your grants program can play. So we're not trying to be a grants program really. We have ideas about grants and we could run our own grant ship, but it's kind of just this space carved out for grants programs. And that's why I say that it's a governance system more than it is a grants program. It's like governance, smart contracts enforced governance system for grants, so that if that shape of governance appeals to your DAO or your organization, you can fire it up, and there's room for grants programs in there. So it's like one level up on the meta.
In this interesting spot where we know that existing token holder governance is flawed. It leads to plutocracy. The political economies on top of them can get toxic. There's too much overhead to review proposals. And I'm really excited about this cycle of figuring out capital allocation that minimizes governance in the sense of what it looked like in the last cycle, and explores this new search space of how do we allocate capital in a way that helps these communities fund what matters. But yeah, it feels like you guys have built a container for exploring that search space, which I think is cool. And yeah, I think it really depends on how the pilot goes, but as a conceptual framing, it seems really interesting.
Yeah, that's pretty much where we're at too. Is like we gotta push it out there. We'll probably watch it get broken in a bunch of different ways, and then we put it back together and release it again, and continue the process over and over until I think at least we're able to confidently say that we've tested our fundamental premise. And once we get there, we can sort of make a determination of like, was our hypothesis correct, really?
I was just going to say that, underneath it all are some contracts that do certain things. It's built on some allo strategies. And so we have this idea that it's a grants program, but it's kind of a state machine with money flowing through it. And it'd be kind of cool if people look at it and see what it does. And it has some great mechanisms in there to kind of enforce funds flowing in a certain way with a lot of visibility. And it may be that you want to put some funds into it and use it in a way that we haven't thought of at all. It's some contracts. We've got our ideas on top of it. Definitely would work as an evolutionary container. What we call it, wrong pathing. Like when you cut through the yard because somebody built a sidewalk and you take the shortcut. We might see some of that with these contracts as well.
Yeah, we got nerd sniped pretty hard when listened to the Allo Greenpill. They just generally like the idea. It's a very like fundamental truth about DAOs is we become really good at taking in capital, but pretty horrible at distributing it to a certain degree, at least. Not, I wouldn't say horrible, but not great. So we were definitely, it was like top of mind for us. And what this is basically is it's an allo strategy that creates other allo or like will deploy other allo strategies and kind of keep them within the same bounds or rules. And the idea is to eventually, there's this big store of allo strategies ready for people to play with, and raid that store, turn them into grant ships and compare and play and see how they do.
Yeah, I feel like now that we're talking about this, I'm tempted to take one of the ideas in the Gitcoin Rainbow paper, which is where we laid out a plurality of different allo strategies that could be built. Like, I want to fund like 10 different teams building 10 different allocation strategies and put them in a grant ship container and like
That's awesome.
have them compete with each other in a
Yeah.
battle bots type thing. So
Great.
I don't know,
That'd be so cool.
maybe that's something that we could do
Yeah.
in the future. Well, I'd love to have you guys. It's great to hear that you were nerds tonight by the Allo Green Pill episode. Now I'm doing 15 or 20 episodes about capital allocation. So, would love to just make space for you all to respond to sort of the thesis behind this season, which is we all do capital allocation all the time, from like paying your friends back for dinner to paying your bills to things that are full-time jobs for people like VC funding or or like government grants. Our hypothesis is that capital allocation off chain in the old world is mirrored by gatekeeping and is not scalable and it's not precise. We have the potential with on chain capital allocation to build more democratic, more transparent, accessible, powerful, evolutionary capital allocation mechanisms. And that it just feels very powerful to me to have these programmable smart contracts. We can program our values into our money and build scalable, precise capital allocation mechanisms on chain. And so, would love to just make space for you all to react to that hypothesis. And if there's anything that you think I missed or that I got wrong, let me know. And yeah, I'm curious if there's anything interesting about that design space to y'all.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot there, but maybe we can do a round robin. Go ahead.
Yeah, the way I see it, kind of the old world way of doing things, there's certain patterns that we've homed in on over time for starting businesses, running governments, and such, that are just kind of assumed as the way to do it. Anytime I hear somebody talk really specifically about like startup funding and like all of the terminology that goes into it, and they're like, this is the way it's done. I'm like, well, that's the way you're doing it. It isn't necessarily the only way to do it. And there's kind of this unbundling and decomposition that happens in Web3, where we're kind of taking apart the machine and putting the pieces on the floor and saying, how could we reassemble these? And it's like the blessing and the curse, because a lot of my experience in DAOs feels like I'm standing in a warehouse surrounded by parts, and there's 100 different people picking them up and being like, what about this part? Let's do it this way. And it's kind of chaos once you disassemble the order. However, there's a lot of potential in there, and as you start reassembling them into new shapes, you've got to kind of see which ones work. Like, can they compete with the other patterns? Those other patterns exist because they've worked. They've kind of evolved over time. People try things and they work or they don't. And so here we are in this ripe space where we can create almost anything, and it's important to create your distinctions, this and not that. And I think there's kind of a tendency toward just like complete openness, almost anarchy. Like, don't make any rules. The magic comes out of the creativity of the crowd, and we'll just see what happens. But there's definitely a place to create some structure, create some rules, create some games, and say, hey, let's play it this way and see how it goes over time. And, in this case, that's what we're doing. We've basically designed a board game that we hope also allocates capital well.
I love that idea of taking it apart and putting it on the ground and sort of like reassembling the capital allocation machine from first principles, based off of assumptions that are on chain, as opposed to what it would exist in the past. That feels like a powerful metaphor to me.
Mm-hmm. And having the on-chain enforcement is a big, because a lot of those ideas out there in the old world are, just we have like the drivers installed in our brains, and somebody who will diligently enforce them in a spreadsheet or something, but it requires a lot of consensus, and there's a lot of room for people to break the rules, or we use law to enforce it, right? Like, that's like old world governance. When you've got contracts, you can kind of be like, this contract ain't going to work anyway except the way we coded it. You get code is law. I don't actually need people to grok every nuance. I can sort of have the contract hold the rails for a certain game, and then we get to focus on the things we want to focus on. So a lot of potential.
The previous, to add on to that, like the previous fundamental assumptions about organizational design are sort of probably null at this point. Like it's like we've been cooking for thousands of years and we still haven't discovered salt. Um, now we got a new flavor or a new part of the flavor spectrum to play with, right? And so we need to experiment. There's an absolute necessity for that because now we have to, let's try things out and see how it works. And we need a way to look at that and compare and contrast.
Yeah, and one thing that just on a little more like real terms, like I've noticed that kind of during this downturn in there's been a lot of protocol development. A lot of these parts that we're putting together have been developed over the last little while, and there's been a lot of protocols that kind of build their front ends to kind of demonstrate what they can do. And we're kind of excited that we've been able to take some of these protocols and mesh them into a product that can actually produce some results, and also leaving the door open for new protocols to come in and be part of grant ships. So I'm pretty excited about that sort of design space that has been opened up with all this protocol development that's been going on. Because really, some of these contracts are puzzle pieces, and that's what we've done is kind of
Yeah.
put together our little puzzle. Yeah.
It's like really a confluence of factors. There's a bunch of DAOs with hundreds of millions of dollars of token treasuries. There's also people who are working on capital allocation mechanisms. There's now people who run grants programs, and so it's really a perfect storm to kind of start exploring this design space. And that's one of the things I want to do in this Greenpill season is just highlight the people who are doing the coolest experiments. So yeah, I can't wait to see what we discover this market cycle. And yeah, hopefully it pushes DAO governance forward to have run these experiments during this part of the cycle. But yeah, we'll see. I think we can only imagine what the results will be, and they'll only be obvious in hindsight. Okay, so I guess we're getting towards the bottom of the hour. We only have 10 more minutes before we have to wrap, but um I'll start moving towards my wrap up questions. The first is, if you're maximally successful, what does grant ships and the ecology of capital allocation around it look like in 10 years? So 10 years forward, what does this look like if you're maximally successful?
I think that the world of capital allocation on chain can grow to nation state levels. I spent a lot of time listening to Juan Bonet. He was on your program before, and I really think that grant chips could sort of strive towards those goals of nation state type funding for research, development, or whatever needs to be allocated to. In 10 years, I think we can reach that sort of goal.
Yeah, so right now, I think we're all thrilled that there's tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in DAOs, but I think the United States spends on the order of trillions of dollars per year. So what is that, like 4 or 5 orders of magnitude before we're operating at that level?
Yeah.
Don't hold me to that math. That's just napkin math, but
Yeah.
a lot of growth ahead if this is figured out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Anyone else have a reaction to that? If y'all are maximally successful in 10 years, what does it look like?
Yeah, I guess kind of reiterating on like before, I think the some of our assumptions about like what is best practices are tested and perhaps overturned or perhaps solidified. And if grant chips is maximally successful, it'll be sort of the place where the new idea comes to be tested. And that just sort of that's just kind of how people's minds map to it, is that, like, oh well, that sounds like a great idea, go test it there. And I think that would be awesome.
yeah, just the smart contract machine running at full speed with lots of funds flowing through it and everything working well and allocation happening. It's like the pattern of grant ships. It seems like something that every DAO should consider. I, even if you just used one grant ship inside of it, it's still a pretty awesome container for a grants program because it provides the visibility and the revocable permissions. So a shape like grant ships, I think, ought to be, just like a meme that goes, having something like this for your DAO, and then having something that, patterns like this for other aspects of your DAO. This could expand to, like we've talked a little bit about payroll and different areas where you could use similar approaches. So maybe an ecosystem of tools to support DAOs grows out of this, maybe funded by the grants coming out of grant ships. That would be pretty cool. I just see the machine kind of growing and helping DAOs do what they want to do, just to maximal efficiency at some point.
Yeah, I think it's really quite cool to hear the different approaches that you've or the different visions that you have and how they sort of interrelate with each other. Last question, and I'll ask it to all three of you. Would love to hear from all of you. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to say? Maybe we'll go backwards from how y'all responded last time. So Matt, I'll start with you. Not to put you on the spot.
Sure. Anything that I wish you'd asked. I saw this question written down as, what would it be? And I think it would be something in the realm of, big question, why Web3? I'm in this space and working with DAOs largely because I see so much potential and just saw so much potential wasted in traditional organizations. I was in the Air Force, U.S. Air Force for a little while, and that's a very structured environment. And there's actually a lot of really good things about a very structured environment, but it's very hierarchical. Like you wear your uniform and you have your rank and all of this. But there was actually a lot of good stuff in there to having a very well organized system. Go into the corporate world disappointed in different ways and kind of um, see different attempts at how can we organize people in a way that helps us each bring out our gifts and work together to accomplish a larger mission together. And that's kind of what we're hacking at here. It's like this little microcosm of how do we allocate grants well, but a system like what we've built, I think, would let people get into the seat where it's like, what you need to do, your job description is well defined, you've got the tools that you need to do it, and we want to see what you're capable of. Go. Like you don't have that human, like a boss telling you how to do it or whatnot. This this little chip on the iceberg that I'm trying to do here in 1 minute is very big. uh, but I think it's really just about creating places where people can work well together and have fun doing it and create cool stuff without the pain and suffering um, of traditional organizations, and bringing a lot of the great patterns from those orgs and using this awesome technology of smart contract governance. Uh, so I don't know what the question is that I wish you asked, but I like talking about that topic. I'm not going to go on too long, but really what we're talking about is the coordination. We talk about that all the time. How do we get ourselves to work together well for a beautiful future?
Love that. Jordan, Chris, I'm curious if you have a reaction to the same question. Is there anything I didn't ask that you want to say?
You sort of got to the core of it pretty fast. I think I'm satisfied. like, I'm sure I'll think of like 20 things once we leave the call, but yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just excited to keep pushing Web3 forward and seeing what we can do with it. So I'll leave that as my final remark.
Yeah, I could say I'm excited about DAOs right now. Like if we're doing that, like it was getting sort of dreary a while back, and I am really excited to see where things are going. It's kind of like we're slowly lowering one leg into the big boy pants. Like it's we're seeing how it might actually start coming together, and that's exciting.
Yeah, for sure. Well, this has been a really fun episode. I think that you're going to break some brains with how you're approaching doing capital allocation with Grantship, and I enjoyed the conversation. For the listeners, if you check out the show notes, you can get a link to everyone's Twitter that was on the episode, and also get a link to grantships.fun, which is the website for this project. So, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining the Greenpill podcast.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah,
guys.
thank you for having us.
Alrighty, we just heard from Chris, Jordan, and Matt from Grantships. I'm excited about them because I think the way that they are creating an evolutionary fitness game to discover the best capital allocation mechanisms is super cool. That's a mouthful. They're basically building a way of running multiple grants programs running against each other, and I just think that that's cool. They have a similar vision to me, where we've got a pluralistic ecosystem of capital allocation that all complements itself, and so it's really cool to see Grantship, and I wish them well on their pilot. Thanks for listening to the GreenPilled.network podcast. This podcast features the people who are building a coordination, a network society of thousands of hackers, dreamers, and doers focused on using crypto to bring positive sum digital systems to the world, like Grantships. If you value our work, please go to pods.media/greenpill and find this episode and collect it. And while you're at it, might as well make an offering to our algorithmic overlords. Please subscribe, rate, and review. It really helps build the regen crypto movement by telling the algorithm that you enjoyed this show. All right, thanks for listening, and see you on the next one. Peace.